Hi and welcome to today's live chapter reading of Captured by the Viscount by Wareeze Woodson, courtesy of Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. In the year of our Lord 1802, only a single day before her 21st birthday, Isabel planned to embark on a dangerous venture. She straightened her shoulders and drew a deep breath, cringing at the necessary evil of her intended actions. She mustn't make a mull of it when she entered the Viscount's establishment. With tension swamping her, she flexed her fingers. The rain should help cover her attempt at housebreaking. Stepping forward ever so quietly onto the terrace of the Viscount's London dwelling, she looked around to survey her surroundings and levered the door ajar. Barely missing the eye of watchmen on patrol, she slipped through the opening. However dangerous the circumstances, she must regain her mother's wedding ring at the very least. Searching frantically through the study, she located her precious jewellery. With her heart beating loud enough to deafen her, she sighed in relief and quickly stuffed all of her recovered items into her leather bag. As much as she regretted the necessity, breaking into the Viscount's residence, however dishonest and dangerous, had been the only way to recover her belongings. Besides, returning the Viscount's stolen bonds was the proper thing to do. The documents had been taken by her half-brother, the Viscount's secretary. In the act of restoring the certificates to the top desk drawer, a barely audible sound to her left drew Isabel's attention. A quiet sigh of the door swinging open alerted her to the threatening stranger's presence, a dark shadow filling the threshold. Paralysed by fear, she couldn't move. Even her lungs seemed frozen. Had the Viscount returned from a full fortnight earlier than expected? From the corridor, a candle flame in the wall sconce flickered and glinted off the inlaid silver on the stock of the menacing gun. Mesmerised by the pistol pointed directly at her heart, she caught her breath, unable to move or even swallow. Why oh why had she scooped up the jewellery first? Caught with the documents still in her possession, she flinched. Disaster had indeed struck. The drapes billowed on a sharp breeze before settling back to the floor with a barely discernible swoosh. She shivered as her drenched coat swung against her skirts, shifting the layers of her under petticoats with a chilling heaviness. The damp cloth clung to her ankles, while moisture trickled down her forehead into her eyes. Deeply aware of her peril, she scarce blinked, her gaze captured by the gun, her heart beating at an alarming rate. The long case clock in the hall chimed once, echoing down the empty passageway. Despite the lateness of the hour, the sound of a carriage rumbling over the roadbed in front of the mansion reached inside the room. Even at the outskirts of London, she could still smell the heavily rain-washed streets. The distinct odour of the town drifted into the open window, cleansed yet dominated by the stench of horses, foot traffic and smouldering coal. It could only be the Viscount holding the pistol. Tall, broad shoulders, his very stillness a threat. He stood just inside the room, with the candlelight silhouetting his form. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting a pale light into the room, merging with the candle's meagre flame. He advanced across the room and relieved her of her satchel. "Well, well, little thief, what do we have here?" Bouncing the bag in his hand, he kept his gun trained on her, and motioned to a chair. "You'd best sit while I see what this contains." She swallowed hard. Think. Don't do anything foolish. As long as she remained alive, there was a possibility she could escape. Should she chance a dash down the darkened hallway in a strange dwelling? Tensing every muscle in her body to make the attempt, she froze when he struck a flint to the lamp and light erupted into the room. She gulped in a breath. Not now. Later. He shifted his gaze from inspecting the contents of her satchel to her person. His voice thickened close to a growl. "I said sit." He pawed through the stolen documents and glared at her. His tone lowered, menacing, gruff. "As I suspected, little thief, you stole my investment certificates." He watched her for a moment, his stillness and his chilling scrutiny deeply menacing. "And my cash. Some jewellery as well. Naughty girl." Moving closer, he lifted her chin to the light. My, a lady of your appearance must have ample opportunities to live much higher than this, pampered beyond measure, safe without endangering your precious person in this manner. She jerked her chin from his touch, scorched by the contact with his fingers. You have no right to touch me. Catching a handful of her dark hair, he pulled her out of the seat, forcing her within a few inches of his lips. The scent of his shaving soap lingered on his skin, filling her senses with his disturbing essence, choking her with fear. His penetrating, emerald green eyes captured her gaze, searching, probing, accusing, while his tone dropped to a snarl. No right! You're a thief, a rotten thief. I caught you in my house at the dead of night with my property in your satchel. I should inform the constable and have you arrested immediately. With horror at the threat, she struggled against the encroaching darkness, whirling, overwhelming, and all-consuming. Lord Rutherford must never discover her true identity. Her half-brother worked as a Viscount's secretary. If Lord Rutherford learned the truth of her relationship to Edgar, he'd assume her half-brother was responsible for this catastrophe. Edgar would blame her, and his rage would prove more disastrous than most any threat offered by her captor. Edgar had long since transferred his hatred of his stepmother to her. He had never accepted a stepmother or a sibling, half or not. He always taunted Isabel with being only a half a Carlyle, half a sister, and not even half good enough for worthy treatment. Isabel swallowed. When pitting the known against the unknown, Edgar against Lord Rutherford, her throat tightened in fear and indecision. With his uncompromising masculinity, would Lord Rutherford have pity on her, a female, alone and vulnerable? Judging by the way in which he handled her and his expression, she doubted he had such compassionate instincts. He had a temper as well. Still, Edgar had boasted to his cousin Ralph about his employer, Lord Rutherford. Curling his lip, her half-brother had sneered while relating the Viscount's fairness in all of his dealings, his honour and his integrity. Edgar had laughed and slapped his cousin on the back, but in spite of his mocking tone, she'd heard a tinge of respect in the ridicule. A faint hope bloomed in her heart. Perhaps Lord Rutherford would listen to her with a certain objectivity. She blinked and averted her gaze. The cash is mostly mine. The jewellery is mine too. A likely story, he snapped, his tone sharp, dismissive. You're a liar as well as a thief. Both are reprehensible. I despise both equally. I do not tell lies. With a sweep of his gaze, close and personal, he inspected her again. You seem a trifle young for this sort of activity. Little more than a schoolroom miss. I'm not a child. I'm 1 and 20. The currency and the jewellery do belong to me. Laced with desperation, her voice thinned. She could hear the unwitting pleading in her tone. I didn't steal your wretched bonds. I was returning, not taking your documents. You've no right to keep me here. You must let me go. He glared down at her for a full minute and then flexed his jaw. His nostrils flared and he lifted his brows. Release you? His incredulous expression darkened with anger. I caught you with my certificates in your satchel, in my house, in the middle of the night. Not during the day, honest and above board as needed to return my bonds, but in highly suspicious circumstances. And I should allow you to walk out of here? He snapped his fingers. Just like that? She swallowed. What could she say in her defence? Nothing. She caught his glance again, his expression stern, a little grim in the shifting light. What are you going to do with me? Silence. The same stare, the same fierce expression, and the same threatening stillness filtered back at her. She shrilled, Why won't you answer me? Twisting away, he slipped the pistol into his pocket and paced across the room, each step heavy, deliberate, thudding against the polished floor. I'm thinking. Could she manage to escape now with the gun safely residing in his pocket? She glanced at the door under her lashes, only to be trapped by his intense gaze once more. With his fingers laced behind his back, he stared at her. Perhaps you shall serve me better in another capacity. The harsh look he levelled at her, alert, assessing, firmly fixed on her, seemed almost as menacing as the pistol. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to explode. She couldn't prevent the slight break in her voice. "What do you mean?" He caught her by the arm, dragging her out into the hall and up a flight of stairs to the next level. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened until she had to fight down the need to scream at the pain. "You're hurting my arm." "Damn, that wasn't my intention," he muttered, and loosened his grip, shaking her slightly. "Behave, or it shall not go well with you." He frowned down at her and forced her along the corridor to the first chamber on the right. The sconce in the hall scattered light into the room, onto the foot of the bed's grey velvet duvet. "No," she halted, dragging against his hold, her breath coming in small gasps. He laughed, harsh, mirthless. "You little fool, I'm not going to ravish you. Not yet, anyway." He removed her wet cloak with one hand and pushed her onto the bed, before stripping her of her muddled walking boots. With that he palmed a small knife and cut the laces of her stomacher before slicing the ties of her dress. He didn't halt until her corset fell open, exposing her lightly clad body to his view. He ripped the remainder of her apparel off, leaving her in her thin chemise. He held her palms together with one hand and reached for the curtain tassel. He wrapped the cord around her wrists and tied the end behind her, beneath the bed frame. Forcing her mouth open, he stuffed his handkerchief inside, binding the gag with another cord. Covering her slightly damp form with a blanket, he tucked the cover around her and stepped away from the bed. "I do apologise, my dear, but I can't trust you not to raise the alarm and draw attention to your captivity." He reached for a linen cloth and gently blotted her forehead, her cheeks and her throat to remove the remaining drops of rain. "I must abandon you for a spell." He held out one finger. Before he quit the room, he added, "I shall return as soon as possible, never fear." Never fear. The man belonged in Bedlam. She was near succumbing to the vapours. Tugging against the cord, she struggled until she collapsed with exhaustion. How long did she have before his return? Panic seized her. The horror of what she may yet be forced to endure sent her into another spasm of twisting in an attempt to break free. She tried to scream around the gag, but her mouth was so dried by the cloth she could barely make a sound. If she hadn't listened to her half-brother and his cousin from behind a closed door, she wouldn't be in this predicament. He stole the bonds. Blast him and his envy. Edgar had taken the last of her jewellery, given to her by her father, along with her mother's wedding ring and her grandmother's emeralds. Recalling his plans for the items sent her into a rage even now. His employer had given Edgar a se'night away from work. He'd bragged to Ralph about stashing all the items at Lord Rutherford's establishment while he was away. Edgar had referred to her as a snooping little tart. He'd said his employer's place seemed the safest place to keep the jewels until Ralph could contact his buyer. Helpless anger consumed her. If only she could thwart his plans. Just once make him pay for his harsh treatment of her. She would jump at the chance. She yanked again at the cord digging into her wrists, reminding her of her vulnerability. Why had she been rash enough to think she could collect the jewellery, plus the ring, and go merrily on her way? She should have known Edgar wouldn't have his facts straight. If leaving town had ever been in the Viscount's intention, he'd obviously returned early, or never left in the first place. A sob broke loose behind the gag. This had given her a chance to escape her half-brother Edgar's harsh rule. With Ralph's help, Edgar had depleted her dowry to nothing. Having stolen Lord Rutherford's bonds, Edgar intended to assign the blame for the missing certificates to the Viscount's young cousin. Besides collecting her jewellery, she decided to restore the bonds as well. Anything to foil Edgar's plot before her exodus from his life. Tears gathered in her eyes. Thwarting her half-brother had seemed worthwhile all those hours ago. Not pausing to consider the consequences, with reckless abandon she'd plunged into the task of returning the stolen goods and retrieving her jewellery. She'd definitely read too many novels of knights in shining armour riding to the rescue. Never once had she considered the handicap of her gender, skirts and all. A hero from the past had been well versed in stealthily entering and exiting the premises of her breaking heads and coming away with a victory. She'd failed.